Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, albeit asynchronously, at the Talking Across the World conference being hosted by the Hong Kong Polytechnic, the Department of English, and the Research Centre for Professional and Business Communication in English in particular. I want to thank everybody who has been involved in pre-recording my presentation. As some of you will know, I'm just recovering from COVID and preferred not to get up in the dead of night. So this time last year, this time 2 years ago, 2019, I used this slide in the last Talking Across the World at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, which was a physical conference, to communicate the sheer force of technology and the emergence of robotics and artificial intelligence in the way we communicate with customers. At that time, things were moving along very, very quickly, and virtual agents were fast augmenting customer service agents as they did their work in the contact centers. And in particular, we were interested in the front office service, where we have what we call attended RPAs, where humans were working side by side with RPAs to make customer service much more efficient. And it was being said at the time, 89% of workers in the BPO industry will experience change related to artificial intelligence. And we saw this close up, where manual work, basic cognitive thinking and communication and numeracy skills were being hard hit and were fast being replaced. But as the McKinsey Global Institute report said in 2018, higher cognitive skills, social and emotional skills, leadership and advanced technological skills would fast become in high demand. And this was what we were interested in going on to research. And in particular, what is the nature of this change communication, where human agents need to work with virtual agents? How do they interface, for example, in handoffs, where a customer service agent receives a big customer complaint because the virtual assistant has been so useless? We were also being asked by the business to actually deal with the communication of the virtual agents themselves. And they would say things like they need to get better, and they need to be more polite, and they need to be more adaptive. And yet there was very little linguistic research or none that was happening in this area. But more than that, in determining and putting together the algorithms for these virtual assistants, it appears that there was no drawing on serious applied linguistic studies. So this was setting us up for a very interesting couple of years. But over the last 18 months, a couple of years, we've had a tsunami of a different kind. And now I want to use this picture as a metaphor for the COVID accelerant to the process of remote work, which is much talked about at the moment across the globe. So how has our world changed? It's changed in a very remarkable way. My world, for example, has changed because I haven't been able to get to the Philippines and India for the last 2 years. It's closed to the world. And the sort of work I'm doing, remote work, where my personal and professional lives are very blurred, have been in Hong Kong and London. And this has been the norm for me over the last 18 months. London is working remotely. The Western English-speaking world is working remotely. Across Asia, around the globe, people are now working remotely. My my grown-up kids, both of whom are in management positions in London, are quite reflective about their communication styles and strategies on Zoom, where they do back-to-back Zoom meetings and end up at the end of each day exhausted. They are quite reflective about how they manipulate and have learned to manipulate the technology to get the most out of their communication, how they must prepare more thoroughly and follow up more thoroughly before and after meetings, how they use language purposefully in meetings, how they read paralinguistic gestures on the small screens. And snapshots of the people that are attending their Zoom meetings. These are big communication challenges. And at the other end of the world, I have a grown-up daughter who is in education. She's a primary school teacher. She has a toddler, and she has been dealing with 27 primary 1 kids on Zoom, Monday to Friday, 4 hours a day. There are big opportunities for applied linguists to be looking at how these sort of communicative exchanges are happening at work and how they unfold. There's a lot of noise and uncertainty about the benefits and drawbacks of remote local work. People are not sure whether there are benefits overall or drawbacks overall. There's uncertainty about performance productivity because although there have been the shift towards remote working and it looks as though it might become hybrid and permanent in some way, we're not clear about the benefits. US companies reported they believe they were 50% more productive, 30% about the same, 20% less productive, whereas a Bank of England survey recently reported that they believe 40% of staff were more productive at home, while 37% felt their workforce was less productive. This month in the Financial Times, the contact centre industry in the UK, where home working has doubled, service level performance numbers was 41% negative neutral and 38% positive. A lot of uncertainty about the productivity. There's uncertainty about whether to go back to work and who should go back to work. David Solomon at Goldman Sachs sees remote work as an aberration, and he wants all their people back in the office as soon as possible, whereas KPMG signals a shift to home working and closing offices. JP Morgan has looked at certain groups being more negatively affected than others, particularly where there's creativity and induction and a culturalization that needs to take place. And interestingly, Deloitte's reported yesterday in one of the papers that it's reconfiguring and refurbishing its office space in a different way. And the different way is directly related to the way they predict their workers are going to be communicating now at work. So the individual officers, or indeed even the big open plan offices, are giving way to different utilization of office space to enable communication. There's some interesting areas of multimodal communication research embedded in that one. Standard Chartered ran a competition recently to come up with ways in which virtual communication can be enhanced. And the winner of that competition was someone that came up with a holographic water cooler designed to help encourage virtual conversations at the bank as it shifted to more hybrid working. So most seem to be proposing some sort of hybrid work, and there's a certainty that remote work in some form is here to stay. All right, the future is in remote work. So how does remote work impact communication, and what are the opportunities for applied linguistic research? So I started to think about this in terms of previous studies on virtual communication that have been taken, that have taken place over the last decade in more confined and constrained situations, and how we might resurrect these and build and extend on those. In 2012, an Australian bank with global sites around Asia earmarked a problem and sent off a request for proposal to a group of consultants, where they said there is evidence that the effectiveness of management in remote or virtual context is diminished when people don't recognize the shift required or are not given enough space to think about the challenges and can address them specifically. They said employer survey data has highlighted micromanagement, lack of trust, confused accountability stemming from lack of clear direction and poor relationship building in the remote and virtual environment. I did a literature review. We were lucky enough to get win this tender, and I immediately did a literature review to look at the issues of communication in global virtual teams, and found that the disciplines of business management, sociology, technology, psychology, organizational behavior were much more active than applied linguists in this space. In fact, Hines and al. Said research on global teams documents the challenges of working across cultures and geographic barriers and highlights the role of potential fissures between the distant locations that can lead to unhealthy and subgroup dynamics. Work to date, however, remains largely silent on how the actual dynamics unfold, on how the particular attributes of globally distributed teams contribute to these potential fissures and their activation, and on the role that language plays in these dynamics. The remote work publications during the pandemic are revealing. The first off the block are American business management consultants that are 2021. You can see here, remote work revolution, succeeding from anywhere, suddenly virtual, making remote meetings work. Interestingly, they are silent on the actual language dynamics that are unfold in these meetings. They are not in any form applied linguistic studies. So the best that we get is things like don't use idioms in meetings. There's a lot more that applied linguists can contribute. So I have been recently reminded about the language studies that have taken place in virtual teams, and certainly Erica Darrick's edited a very good book on technology in communication, Bana Rasmanan et al. in 2014, and Gail Forry and myself used data from the study of the Australian virtual team management to look at specifically how discursive control and power unfolds in virtual meetings, and it's referenced there. So they're very limited studies, but let's look at what these studies might offer as a first step into looking at applied linguistic opportunities and challenges going forward. So what did this applied linguistic study tell us? Well, here we had a group of Australian managers who were having to work with their teams overseas in what were highly collaborative settings with colleagues in New Zealand, India, and Singapore. We focused particularly on someone called Miles, and we did a detailed linguistic analysis of his interaction in these collaborative virtual meetings across Asia. And he was working on a new piece of banking software, and it was a highly collaborative project. Miles himself was highly motivated. His collaborative teams were not working. He complained that people weren't participating and that he was working extra hard in the process, but he was failing to communicate, and he was highly motivated to know why. So our research question was, why was Miles failing to communicate effectively with his remote team? We used two applied linguistic frameworks, turn-taking analysis with Shegeloff and the appraisal analysis, Martin and White, which is part of systemic functional linguistics. So first of all, we looked at the Shegeloff framework, and this table was very revealing. Miles was a man in Melbourne, but he was sitting in the Melbourne office with Matt and Tom. They were physically together. And what is revealing here, when you look at the attendees in all these meetings, this meeting, which were mostly people from India and a couple from Singapore, was that the number of turns were 196, but Miles, Matt and Tom between them took 139 of those. That the speech duration was 43 minutes and 51 seconds, and Miles, Matt and Tom between them took up 36 minutes. And Miles and Tom had the two highest average time per turn. So that table tells you that Miles was doing most of the speaking and taking most of the turns, followed closely by Matt and Tom, which you can see there very dramatically. What was going on in Miles's turns? Well, first of all, there were no pauses. He used so 55 times. He was filling in pauses, and he was using this as a device to take self-selecting turns. So what I'll do is, so one of the key factors was, so if you actually think about and so forth. I mean, this was remarkable in the 43-minute analysis meeting that we analyzed. We then looked at systemic functional linguistics and appraisal theory in particular. Now, appraisal theory focuses particularly on the interpersonal metafunction, where it unfolds dynamically. The interpersonal exchange unfolds dynamically to engage us, to get us on side, not with one appeal, but through a spectrum of maneuvers that work themselves out phase by phase. So we were interested, we decided to go in and look at the interpersonal function, the who, what was going on in this dynamic, and to use appraisal as a way into getting a much more detailed analysis of what was going on in this meeting. So the thing about appraisal theory is that it has three nodes in the appraisal: engagement, that develops solidarity and alignment; attitude, the thing that helps us judge others and their behavior; and graduation, the thing that intensifies or decreases the intensity of our judgments. Well, we decided to focus on engagement, all right, which are all those language choices: modality, polarity, concession, consequentiality, and projection, which provide the means for the authorial voice to position itself with respect to and hence engage with other voices and alternative positions construed as being in play in the current communicative context. This seemed a perfect place to enter in and have a look at. So the appraisal system is quite straightforward. We looked at engagement. It was heteroglossic because there were many people in the meeting, and we decided to go in and analyze why the language was being contracted and closed down rather than expanded and opened up. So if you go into contract, we decided to look at proclaim rather than disclaim, because there was a lot of, there would inevitably be a lot of nuance in proclaim. And we decided particularly to look at concur, pronounce, and endorse. So concur refers to the choice of language that attunes the interlocutor with the speaker's own position. That is the language choice that overtly announces the addressers agreeing with or having the same knowledge as the same projected partner. So this is manifested in language such as naturally, of course, obviously, admittedly, and also sets of rhetorical or leading questions or even question tags. Well, what we found was that Miles used a lot of concur, which means, of course, we need to do a lot of forward planning. Obviously, he talked about there's certainly the right people, and even the rhetorical question. And if you think about it, Eric, the color that describes him is red, very people-oriented. Why? Always asking how people are feeling. So a lot of concur there. Pronouncement formulations involve authorial emphasis, which are directed against some assumed or directly referenced counterposition, manifested in language such as the truth of the matter is, there can be no doubt that. And we found that Miles used a lot of pronounce. We have worked out a standard way of doing it. I like facts and I'll keep playing with my facts. I've got no issues with stuff going through as long as you don't stuff it up. And finally, endorse. And these are formulations which external sources are construed by the authorial voice as correct, valid, undeniable, and otherwise maximally warrantable. Well, Miles used a lot of endorse to invoke senior management authority. Fred and Brian were his two main line managers in the Melbourne office. So a lot of verbal projecting clauses that were endorsing. Fred's not hearing enough news, Brian is keen to hear, Fred made it clear, and mental projecting clauses. Brian's got some immediate concerns, Brian decided we needed an offsite, and so forth. And Miles also used endorse to build internal solidarity onshore. As we previously said, Matt and Tom were sitting in the Melbourne office with him. As Matt and I were agreeing about this morning, Tom's done a brilliant job in that space. Matt and I decided, and so forth. This was all taking place in the space of the 43 minutes. Finally, use of consequentiality in Miles's speech. If unless type clauses that can construe order, explanation, warning, and hypothetical offer. There were 38 consequentiality utterances in this meeting, and 15 of them were warnings and orders. If the business guys say it's a brilliant job, make sure it gets back to the team. Unless you have a good forward overview of what's coming up, we're going to be banging ourselves up against a brick wall. So a lot of consequentiality. So the summary of the linguistic findings was, first, Miles dominated the time of talk and turn taking, including high level of self-selecting turns. Miles uses a high level but nuanced kind of contracting type language that closes down interaction by building solidarity with one group seemingly at the expense of the other, stating and pronouncing his position, invoking authority. There were other things that were going on in Miles's language. He used rich use of metaphorical language and idiomatic expressions that are quite common in Australian L1 speech. The thing about this was that Miles wasn't aware of the kind of language he was using. He was not aware of the nuances of his language. You point out idiomatic expressions and he can see that immediately. But the kind of language he was using was really not conducive to full participation that he so much wanted in this collaborative meeting where they were developing innovative new software packages. So this study provides a kind of foundation to define new challenges for L1 exchanges. This is not just a second language, first language issue. Anywhere English is used, increased awareness of how language use impacts our colleagues in remote settings is of intense interest. I mean, to date, we've been looking at language accommodation and cultural adaptability, the assumption that we need to fix L2 comprehensibility and standardize our language, whatever that means. This new challenge in the growing remote work context onshore suggests it's important for a new awareness of how our language use impacts others, whether they're L1 speakers or L2 speakers. So the research challenges in the use of language in remote settings could focus on things like intra-language reflection and how do we do this? How do we self-analyze our own language and diagnostically profile our own communication styles and strategies? So we're much more aware of this, and what are the implications of such profiling? So new communication challenges can relate to so many things. Numbers of people in a meeting. What are the optimal numbers across different meeting purposes? Why do we have an hour for meeting or half an hour meeting? Our technology systems are set to do this, but is this something that needs to change? What is involved in pre and post remote meeting work that are reportedly so much more important with remote work? And do we have to have agreement on ways of engaging with each other in a kind of project charter of communication? Everyone wants to get better at remote meetings, but language use is our own responsibility in new and remote work contexts. So thanks everybody, and I hope we have an agenda for the next few years on looking at our own, the impact of our own communication styles in remote contexts. Thank you, everybody. And here are references. Hi, everybody. It's Jane here. I'm sorry I can't be with you synchronously this morning, but I'm really looking forward to joining this afternoon and listening to all the sessions this afternoon, catch up on what happened in the morning, and I'm sure it's going to be a very informative and stimulating session. So look forward to seeing you this afternoon.